So welcome, Christine.
Feel free to move up if you need to, or don't feel like you have to stay. I'm not scary. So just to start off, I'm curious to see, I know a couple of people know me, so they're not allowed to answer, but can you guess what country I was born in?
Australia.
Yes, actually, Australia. Pretty good. Yeah, so I'm actually a dual citizen. I was at birth. My mom grew up in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. My dad's Australian. They met in Switzerland, as you do. So I think the first thing is just, you can't make assumptions based on looking at somebody, where they're from, what their story is. You have no idea. I used to have the Australian accent. Sadly, I moved to the US when I was about 4 and lost it, so apologies, I can't speak in that. So I am the Director of Immigration Legal Services. I oversee the employment services and immigration at Arrive Ministries. I've been there for about 5 years. It'll be 5 years in October. And so over time, you see lots of different things that happen. I'm going to give a really kind of start off with a high-level overview of various things. And then, as I go, please feel free to just pipe up and ask me any questions that you may have. I don't mean to get through everything or cover every topic in here. I really want to be a resource for what you have. But to start off, I'm going to start off with a few categories or words, because immigration is highly detail-oriented. The way you and I talk about somebody versus the way the official immigration services talks about somebody might not be the same. So in U.S. immigration, there are two broad categories. There's immigrant and non-immigrant. Broadly speaking, permanent and temporary. But if you look at this list, you can see that it's not necessarily exactly one for one. So somebody says, I'm here on a work-based visa, you can't assume that's permanent or temporary. It could be either. It could switch at some point from one category to another. You have family-based ones, you have special immigrant visas or SIVs, you have people who come in diversity lottery. Any of these categories have some variations. So my own father actually came to the US on a fiancé visa. And why do I have an asterisk next to that? That's because it's in a special funny category where it starts out temporary and then turns permanent if you fulfill the requirements of getting married. So again, some of these terms can be flexible. And then I put asylees and refugees kind of in their own asterisk category as well, because they never get a visa. But somebody might actually say, I got a visa, and no, they didn't get a visa. They actually got a status that allows them to come here, and it is permanent, but it's not a visa. So, I mean, words and all these different things can be used so many different ways. So I've had some people come into my office and say, I am a refugee. And their story is just like any other refugee in terms of people coming from their country and their experiences and what they've happened. But it turns out, no, they're actually technically not a refugee because they came some other way. And if you didn't come as a refugee in immigration law, you can't be a refugee in immigration law. So as you're working with people, one of the things that happens is you can't always assume that people 100% are saying the right thing in terms of immigration issues. They might be in terms of their story, in terms of their experience, but they're not necessarily going to always 100% correspond with immigration rules or how they define things. And these distinctions are actually very important. So another way of looking at this is you can also look at statuses that you can apply for on your own, or statuses where you need some other involvement, whether that's an active involvement of you are a victim of a crime, and so you need the US police force, somebody in there to actually be involved with certain aspects of your case, or as a refugee, like you can't just walk up to the border and be a refugee. Can anyone tell me the difference between refugee and asylee?
Refugees come in through a government program. Asylees usually are seeking. They come in kind of on their own
So refugees come through a government program, asylees are coming on their own or are seeking something. Any other details to that?
Aren't asylees like fleeing some political persecution of some sort?
All right, asylees are fleeing political persecution. All right, that's true, that's definitely true, yes.
When they do their paperwork, isn't it different? So a refugee does paperwork to come in, and an asylee is in, and they do paperwork to stay.
So that's, in immigration law, where somebody is located is probably the biggest difference between asylee and refugee, and you kind of hit on that there, where a refugee is outside the US somewhere, and they said, you know, I can't go home, help me, they're gonna end up in the US. Listen to Michelle's talk later, she'll give you a lot more details about that process. Asylee has somehow or other made it physically to the US. And that creates some differences between the two in terms of processing, in terms of what rules apply, in terms of what benefits they can access and when. And also, it creates a different story. There's some assumptions in law that someone who has figured out how to get to the US on their own, so someone who's potentially being an asylee, might have a little bit more resources or can do a little bit more or that kind of thing. Whether that's true or not in an individual case is going to vary, but that's where a little bit of the policy decisions might come in. So for a lot of things, refugees and asylees are very, very similar in terms of what they can access, but every now and then you hit some differences in terms of what they can do and not do and what the criteria are. So that's actually a really important distinction. And actually, if you hear in immigration is a very popular topic on the news right now. Lots of different things going around about that. So I've had a lot of people who have actually said like, oh, can't you just come to the US and be a refugee? No, you are never going to walk up to the border of the US and become a refugee. You might, if you file, get asylum, and that's a slightly different process than stuff like that. And so when they're talking on the news about refugees and refugee processing, they're not talking about the people who are walking up to the border or who have come as a visitor and said, I can't go home or something like that. There are two very distinct differences, and that is huge. If you don't remember anything else today, if you already know that, great. If you don't know it, please tell everybody, because that makes a huge, huge difference in the course of discussing immigration issues in this country, because it's a very different story for immigration law. So, but looking at this list, you can see how there's not a lot that you can do without somebody else being involved. You can have your different opinions on whether that's a good thing, a bad thing. You know, there's a whole ton of policy and decision-making on all these things. And so whenever you hear people talk about immigration or what should we do, or, oh, this group of people is doing X, Y, Z, these words matter. It makes a big difference. So, that's kind of the big point here, is that an immigrant can cover someone who has come here with absolutely no resources. It can cover someone who is a multi-billionaire who owns businesses and has come here through investment visa type things. It could be, that's a huge, huge category. But it also could include somebody who's just here temporarily, depending on how you're talking about it. You could have someone who has come here appropriately in the first place and overstayed, whether intentionally or by mistake. They didn't know. I remember talking to someone once who had a visiting visa from a country, and it was a multiple entry visiting visa. So on that, you can come into the country, stay for the period of time they allot you, and then you can go back and come back. Over the course of 10 years, you can use it during that time. Unfortunately, they didn't quite understand that, and they thought, oh, it just means I can stay 10 years. Oops. So they've got some things they've got to work out there. They entered correctly. They were under mistaken impressions as to how long that allowed them to stay. And I can see the confusion. It even says 10 years on the visa, so, you don't quite know what you're talking about. Okay, it can happen.
Just a quick
Yes.
comment. almost 50% of the undocumented in the United States today, estimated around 11 million people, total undocumented. 50% of them came legally into the country. So they didn't come across the border. They came legally, but they stayed illegally, overstaying a student visa, a work permit, other classifications are coming into the country.
So just to repeat that for the video or anyone who couldn't quite hear it, the statistics are about over 50% of people who are here improperly, illegally, out of status, whatever wording you might use in that, came originally through a valid status, whether it's through a student visa, through visitor's visa, or something else like that. There are a category of people who never had anything, who truly did the whole classic sneak across the border scenario. But you can't just assume that that's what somebody has done if you encounter someone who says, I don't have a status. A lot of people have a lot of immigration history story behind what's going on.
And maybe just another comment, not to take over, but we currently in this midst of this DACA situation. This is the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. That these are people who were given a status even though they came in without a status, and other they were brought in as children before the age of 16. There's 800,000 of them in the United States. They paid $85 for a biometric evaluation, $410 for a work permit that's good for 2 years. And now the situation is, unless Congress acts, 800,000 of them who had a status will no longer have a status and could be eligible to be sent away. So just.
Yeah, so Bob was just talking about some of the stuff going on with DACA, which is Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, which was created to deal specifically with children who are brought here when they're young by parents, could be other family members who maybe brought them. And so unless Congress acts, that program is ending because the program was originally created by presidential order. You can get into the constitutionality of that on your own, but then the other question is, what's the appropriate ethical thing to do to care for people who are in that situation, who have gone through that and put their hand up and said, hey, I'm here. Yes, I recognize I did not enter appropriately, but I've gone through all the processes. And there's actually, they don't talk about this much, but there's criminal requirements on that, where if you have, basically you have to have a spotless record in order to have been given the DACA status. And a lot of the programs that they propose of varying sorts, including that one, really have really stringent requirements in terms of what kind of criminal history and activity you may have had. So they're not like, oh, you know, look, oh, I see 3 felonies. Okay, yeah, sure. No, that's not happening. In fact, this isn't really in my talk, but one of the very important things is that the way immigration law treats crimes is different than criminal law treats crimes. So something that you and I might be actually go, you know what, I'll hire you. I know you had this minor incident one time, no big deal. That doesn't really affect anything. We might be okay with that, or, oh, look, you completed probation, you haven't done anything for 20 years. Immigration law, nothing ever goes away when it comes to criminal law. So it's a big difference, and that can make a huge, that's actually kind of later on one of my things of like things that you can do to help people, is really being clear about minor things can unintentionally turn into very major things when it comes to immigration and crimes and that kind of thing. So it's even better reason to be careful. So just a super highlight on some of this. So I apologize if you guys know this already. Ask me for more details if you want. Common question, green cards. People who, refugees, asylees, refugees after they have been here for 1 year of physical presence, they can file for a green card. Asylees, 1 year after they have been granted asylum status, they can apply for a green card. And then I put a broad category of other, because everything else entails something else aside from just get a green card. The green card is kind of the holy grail of immigration because that starts you on the process down to becoming a citizen, which is, you know, what a lot of people want to do. For people in other categories, there's usually something else you need at the same time. Like you can't just go, I want a green card, or I've been here, I came as a visitor, let me just get a green card. You need other steps or other things involved, you need other family members, that whole list before, you need another intervening factor. Refugees and asylees in this small way are in a slightly privileged group because their status does qualify them to be able to file for a green card. One of the things that's an interesting difference between the two, refugees are technically on the books required to file for their green card after 1 year. It says shall file. Asylees may, or strongly recommended, but it's not actually on the required books. That being said, I have had people who are in refugee status who come into my office 10 years later, never got their green card, and they're finally getting around to doing it. Couldn't ask you why they didn't do it in the first place, but okay. I've never seen anybody get in trouble for that, and there's not anything on the books of saying, like, if you don't, this is what's going to happen to you. But because it does say shall for a refugee, that's a strong recommendation. Good idea. It's an extra layer of protection. It moves them on to the next step. Yes?
They don't have a green card, where are they?
So you're asking about the work permit, or also known as an EAD, Employment Authorization Document. It's a little card. It's usually pink, and that does have an expiration date on it. The reason why refugees and asylees, when they walk off the plane, refugees when they walk off the plane, asylees once their asylum is granted, are work authorized. Technically, according to law, they can work from that moment on, forever. They're never not qualified to work. However, refugees in particular, and often asylees as well, don't have a lot of documentation. To get a driver's license in Minnesota, anyone ever tried to do that without some other form of ID or proof of who you are? Just try doing that one day and see how much fun it is. It is hard. It is very difficult. They have a list, they have their requirements, and that kind of thing. So to get things like a driver's license, and to be able to prove who you are, and to go to an employer and say, this is what you do. So the work authorization document is kind of basically this thing that is a stopgap for providing a form of ID that has a photo on it that can let people do stuff like get a driver's license, that then they can use their driver's license and social security card to go to an employer to say, I'm work authorized. Because a lot of employers don't always immediately know or understand that this person is work authorized even without this document. Employers have a list of documents, and I won't go into the list, but that they need to fulfill certain requirements for identification. There's a lot of advocacy around this. If you have issues with this, please let us know, because there's resources for employers and employees. A common thing that happens is because that work authorization document expires after a year, the client will come and say, my job won't let me work anymore. They say, I'm not authorized anymore. Wrong. They're permanently work authorized, and that employer is actually doing something that is technically illegal. I'll give the employers the benefit of the doubt and say most of the time it's because they just don't understand, and if you talk to them, hopefully they'll be reasonable. There are a few employers out there who are being actively awful, and so they do need some intervention. And there's some great resources for government intervention in that case, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other big next step is citizenship. The basic rule, 5 years of residence in the US. They have 5 years of having their green card. This is another refugee asylee difference. A green card for a refugee backdates to the date they enter the country. So if they walk into my office and it's been 10 years and they never got their green card starts from when they entered the country, and they've been credited all that time. So they can turn around and say, oh, I've had my green card 5 years or 10 years, now I can file for citizenship almost immediately. Not for asylees. Asylees only get granted 1 year of backdating. So if an asylee, they get asylum this year, Next year, they could file for the green card, but they wait 5 years, never got their green card. They're only gonna get a credit of 1 year at the time that they file. So they've spent all this time in the US, and then they still have to keep waiting to be able to get that 5-year mark on their green card. Yes?
So 5 years of residence in the US, 5 years of having a green card.
Those are different, yes. There is a difference between residence and having a green card. So,
Do you get the green card first and then apply for the residency? How?
no, so you're not applying for residency separately. So, basically, the rule is you have to be physically present in the last 5 years before you apply for at least half of that time. So if you have someone who's gone on a lot of trips to other countries, then during you've got to actually literally add up the days that they were outside the US and go, have they hit the 2.5-year mark in the last 5 years to show their physical residency in the US. So there's that. There's also a question about if they take a really long trip, and that's another issue. So usually, most people, 5 years of having your green card and 5 years of residency are almost identical. That's usually most of the case. Sometimes you've had somebody who has done something or taken a really long trip or taken a lot of really small trips where it delays their time when they can apply. It's a case-by-case thing. I'd have to look at the details of particular people. Is that? So that's why they're listed separately, and it's confusing because it's the same amount of time because you're like, well, gee, it looks the same, but there's little different nuances for that. And I put in here, you can apply at 4 years and 9 months. So when you've hit the 4-year and 9-month mark on having your green card, that's when you're allowed to apply. They basically give you 3 months worth of we recognize processing time, so we're just gonna let you file a little bit early. I will add one more note to this, in that if you have somebody who's married to a US citizen, if they fulfill certain requirements, they can file after having their green card for 3 years. So that's the rare exception. But if you have someone coming to you and they're like, I've been in the US for 2 years, I want to file for citizenship, there's a pretty good chance they're not eligible yet. You can ask some more questions and see if there's something else unusual going on, or maybe they are married to a US citizen and so they're getting closer to that date for various things. So, yes?
So then the process after they've been here in the United, this is an asylee, after they've been here in the United States for a year, they can apply for a green card.
Yes. Yes.
Next step after that?
They
So-
would first have to be accepted as an asylee.
Yeah, but
So first step, once your asylum's granted, that's when your date starts for your residency for purposes of filing for your green card. Maybe your asylum application took like 5 years to process or something for some strange reason. It took really, really long. Your date, it's 1 year of having asylum. It's not 1 year of physical residence.
Not 1 year of arrival?
No.
starting
No,
from
so for
arrival.
asylees, it's not the date you arrive in the US that counts, it's the date when you get your asylum. And that is a big difference between a refugee and asylee. And it's a common, so I've had some asylees who have come in and never got their green card and came in like 10 years later and said, oh, I've had asylum for 10 years. Can I get my green card? Okay. And they only get credited 1 of those 10 years because it gets backdated from the date of approval of 1 year. So then they still have to wait 4 more years before they can file for citizenship. That's a big, big difference between those two groups. Then, okay. Next part here is there are 3 basic options. I am not going to go into the details because as one of our staff members knows here, it gets complicated very fast. There are 3 broad, I guess you could call them programs for people filing to bring family members here. I'd say of anything that we get questions in our office about, it's I want to bring so-and-so here. Can I bring them? Who am I qualified for? How long is it going to take? So refugees and asylees, potentially, depending on their status and the time they've been in the US, could qualify for all three of these at the same time, and then they have to make a choice as to which one is best. Sometimes they're only going to fit one of these three programs, sometimes they might fit two out of the three. It depends. So refugees and asylees, there is, I'll start at the bottom here, the AOR, or Affidavit of Relationship Program. What this is doing is saying, I'm in the US, I have refugee status, or I have asylee status, my family is back in maybe Kenya, they too have refugee status in that country, and they have registered. I want to make sure that they get the opportunity to have an interview and to go through the refugee process and come here as well. If that person in the US is a refugee and that family gets approved, they'll come through the refugee program just like they did. If that person is an asylee and they get approved, they'll go through a slightly different process, but they will be allowed to come to the US and get asylum status.
How long does that usually take?
How long does the AOR take? If you're lucky, 2 years. We're seeing more like 5 or more. That one, of any of these three programs, is the hardest to say how long it's going to take. There are long, literally months, if not years, of silence in this program where you do not hear anything, where you may file and it feels like you've sent it off. I've actually had some conversations with clients who were very upset because they actually thought the program was a fake, because it took so long to hear between anything going on. Once we figured out that was the issue and their concern, we were able to address that and assure them, no, this is actually not a fake program. It is real, but it's heavily affected by refugee numbers in the US. So if they have the numbers of people coming into the US as refugees, this program is affected as well. Even though somebody has actually actively said, this person's my family member, it also requires a DNA test. So they are confirmed that this person is related to them in the appropriate manner. Obviously, if you have a husband-wife situation, you don't have a DNA test in the normal sense, but they use other confirmation. The other program that is unique to refugees and asylees is the I-730 program, and this is similar in that the person coming would get the same status as the person who filed. However, they don't have to have refugee status. So you could have someone who came here and said, like, I came to the US as a refugee, and they want to file for their husband. That husband can be, honestly, a millionaire sitting on a beach in Bali, sipping Mai Tais all day, and they could actually come through this program and be declared a refugee because they are gaining their status from the person here in the US. That's pretty unusual. Almost always, everybody in that program has the same story and has also equally been in a tough spot. But it's you have to be here for less than 2 years in order to qualify for that program. For the I-730, for the AOR, less than 5 years. So as you're working with families, if your families are expressing, I want to file to bring someone here, one of the common things that happens is people go, oh, like I don't have enough money, I don't have enough support, I want to wait a while, I want to get a little established. Sometimes that's a good idea for certain things, sometimes that's not. Sometimes because of the amount of processing time, it's good to look into it now and make a decision now. Do you want to wait or do you want to file right now? Because maybe you'll be ready in 2 years when this actually comes through. They're not going to come next week. None of these programs will come next week. So maybe they can go, you know what, I think I'm going to be in a better place in a year. So now's a good time for me to start the process so I can get things going. And then by then, we'll be a little more set up and we'll be ready for them to come. So it always kind of breaks my heart when I have someone who is like, oh, I waited for so long, and you're like, like if you just come in maybe a year ago, we could have done a different program and it would be less expensive. The third program is the I-130 program. So this is for people who have a green card or are US citizens. This is probably the most common thing we file. This one has a lot of fees and can get quite expensive for some people. Some people are no problem, they'll handle it. Other people will be like, whoa, costs over $1,000 minimum in just fees alone. That's not including airfare, that's not including all the little extra incidentals that you're gonna end up needing to get. Like maybe they have to go and get a government document and pay for that. So somebody who has come here as a refugee, who has been here for less than 2 years and wants to file for their husband to come here, could fit into all three of these categories at the same time, and they're gonna be making a decision about that. So if you're talking with someone who's saying, I filed for mom, I filed for someone to come here, there's a lot of different things that they could be dealing with. You can't just assume that it's gonna be the same process as their next door neighbor or someone else. You never know. Yes?
Can I ask what the fee difference is between the I-730, the AOR, and the I-130?
So, I-130 is over $1,000 for someone to come. The I-730, there's no fee, and the AOR, there's no fee. You have to pay a DNA test in an AOR, but if it matches, then it's paid back by the government. For the I-730, if they ask for certain pieces of evidence or a DNA test, you'd have to pay that out of your own pocket, and you don't get compensated for that. So theoretically, the AOR is the cheapest on this.
Repeat the question.
So the question is, how do refugees or asylees know about these differences or get educated about these things? So there are a couple of different parts where hopefully that's happening. And actually Michelle, I think later today, I again highly recommend her, she's excellent, she knows what she's talking about, she'll probably be able to speak to that a little bit more, but part of the orientation should be talking about some of these programs. There's the secondary question of when you're bombarded by a lot of information, you've just arrived, how much are you taking in? How much does it take to settle in? How good is that person? I mean, I think our staff is excellent, but I can't vouch for every staff agency out there, if they've communicated all of that effectively to people. And this is an area where a lot of people get a lot of like, my friend said, so-and-so did this kind of thing. So there's a lot of things floating around out there and misnomers and all that kind of stuff. So even though we try our best to be able to tell people straight off, you never know what somebody else is hearing somewhere else.
But we provide immigration legal services. We saw this past year 1,300 clients that we were consulting with them and helping them. So if you have a family you're working with and they have questions about this, make an appointment with us or somebody else that's doing immigration legal services in St. Paul or elsewhere. But Christine is an immigration lawyer. We have two other staff that they're seeing clients all the time. They also go up to the CRED organization in Minnesota and the Bhutanese Community Organization in Minnesota, holding clinics up there.
So Bob just gave an ad for us. I'm not going to repeat it. And I'm in terms of just a little more detail on the I-130 program, and I'm mentioning this because a super common question we get is, can I file for my nephew? Can I bring my grandma? General option, no. I will say, if you're working with any former Soviet Union clients, there's a unique program that opens and closes continuously. Ask us for further details about that. But for the I-130, green card holders can only file for a spouse and a child who is not married. And actually, that is a slight misnomer. They can file for a child who is over 21, but it changes the length of time that someone comes. So just unmarried children only. U.S. citizens can file for parents, spouses, children of any age, married or not, and siblings. Now, can anybody guess how long it usually takes for a sibling to get here? What? 10 years. Any others?
15 to 20.
15 to 20, probably, yeah, that's closer. 15 to 20 is pretty close. So what has happened is, depending on the category and how somebody is related, Congress, whoever else is making our laws these days, I don't know, has made declarations about, made decisions like we have a priority on these groups. So generally the priority is spouses and kids who are not married who are under 21. And then for U.S. citizens, they also put parents in that category. So those people don't have a particular waiting list. theoretically, as long as they continue the processing, they get to come in time. So I would say the average for that is about 1 to 2 years, probably closer to like 1.5 or 2. One is like, wow, that went really fast. We're really excited if that happened. Other categories they have a lower priority on. If your kid's married, I guess the theory is the kid's married, they've got someone, life is going okay. They don't need it as much. So they're low on the list. Siblings are the lowest priority. So they get the least amount of numbers and they're the slowest. And if you happen to be from the Philippines, I believe the people who filed in, I want to say estimated 1993, are now eligible to continue the process and complete all the steps. Yeah, so if you hear people talk about immigration reform or talk about family-based stuff, this is one reason why. Because it's like, well, should you have a program that takes 20 years to bring someone here? Should you not? Should you put the numbers somewhere else? Should you put more numbers there? There's a lot of different decision-making on that. And there's different opinions, some better than others. I don't know all the details because it honestly just depressed me too much, so I decided I was not going to read the details. But I've heard people propose slashing all this program and cut the numbers even more. And so it's like, oh, okay, so if your wait list is maybe 7 years, what's that gonna do? How's that gonna even make it go slower? Policy decisions, there's reasons to change things and reasons to keep them the same. A lot of different considerations in that. So, but really, basically, these are who you can file for. You can't file for your niece or nephew, you can't file for your aunt or uncle, grandparents, kind of thing. Yes?
What if your child is married, like say under U.S. citizen, and what about their spouse?
So that is one of the slight pluses. So a U.S. citizen who files for a child who is married can actually bring the spouse with them. So you can bring your child, you can bring the child's wife or husband. And potentially kids that at the time that a visa is available are under 21 as well. There's a whole lot of things about like aging out and like, let's just say you file now and you have a wait time of 10 years and then like when you started the kid was 10 and now the kid is 20 and turns 21 in 3 weeks. That kid might not be able to come anymore and there's a whole lot of different aspects to all this kind of stuff. It's very so main takeaway, if you have someone who says, can I file for so-and-so, ask some more questions and maybe say, let's go talk to somebody about that. Because there's a lot of different nuances, there's a lot of different situations, and occasionally you can have people who can squeeze in or like they had something old filed or something like that, and that can still apply. Or they might be out of luck on certain things and just go, sorry, we can't do anything. So the next thing here is just a few highlights of what can you do? I mean, a lot of this gets complicated very fast. It's very case by case. It's very lawyerly answer. Depends on the situation and the particular people. First off, documents are important. The more you can help somebody remember that, learn that, re-emphasize that, great. I love it when somebody comes into my office and has like a binder with stuff organized. I'm not expecting everybody to be binder people, but at the same time, it is great because that helps them be able to know what's going on, helps them communicate with someone else, even if their perhaps language skills they're not comfortable speaking about it very well, somebody can look at stuff and go, oh, I get an idea of what's going on here and what we need help with.
What documents? I mean, it's even things like bills that show that they've had a residency somewhere.
Right, so you are going to, documents, I'm going to give what documents? I'm going to give a very lawyerly answer and say it kind of depends. But I mean, there's some basics that are really obvious, like birth certificates, marriage certificates, documents about how you entered the country, documents about trips you may have taken, because sometimes that occasionally will make a difference. If they're dealing with filing for a family member, there's going to be a lot of different things about how do they prove that relationship to that person? What kinds of things do they have connecting them to each other? So one of the questions you can honestly ask is, is this a good idea to keep this, or before you throw it away? I have people who like go, oh, I send money transfers back to my family every week. Some people keep those receipts, which is great, shows a relationship, a connection. Other people are like, I never keep those. What are you talking about? I'm like, oh. Now they have to go back to Western Union, MoneyGram, and see if they can try and track down a history. If they have it already, great. If they have absolutely zero intention of ever bringing mom over to the country or something, well, okay, do they really need to keep all the receipts of how they're spending, sending mom, $100 each month? No. But are they sure they don't want to do that? There are just questions about, like, what is your plans? What do you want to do in the future? What is possible? I don't have the luxury in an appointment to be able to sit down and really hear people's stories and to really just be able to take all the time that you working with someone who's in a more of a friend manner can really learn and go, what do you really want to do? That is an important thing. And then you can start to go like, okay, so that's something you want to do. I think that might be possible. And then it's the next stage of how do we research that and what's going to be involved in that. So, that's really the second thing is be your resources to connect other resources. A lot of people don't know who to ask, or they have their buddy who keeps telling them stuff. Maybe their buddy is right. Maybe their buddy is completely wrong. If you hear somebody saying something, you go, that sounds odd, or, then you can go, who did you talk to about this? Let's find someone we can talk to, or as simple as like, here's an agency, why don't you give them a call and talk to them and see what they say about something. Managing expectations, as I say, the wait time on some of these things can be very long. Sometimes it's not too bad, sometimes it goes smoothly, sometimes it does not. I have a case where we filed, it's a green card holder, she's filed it for her husband, we filed in December. Based on the wait time, it's probably going to be 2 to 3 years before the case gets to a point where her husband is eligible for a visa to complete the processing. She's had caseworkers call me, she's called herself multiple times, around about every so many weeks, and I've had to repeat over and over and over again. And it's hard. I don't like saying, like, sorry, we just have to wait. There's nothing happening right now. There's a wait time. Maybe she just needs to hear that from me, I don't know. But that's something that you can be supportive of and understand and listen to people's frustrations. It is frustrating in this process. Small things with surprising impact. A huge reason why some of these cases close or get denied is because they can't find someone. So you can ask questions like, oh, you just moved last week. Did you tell USCIS? I know you have a case open. Do you remember the process of how to do that? If they don't remember, then maybe you walk them through it and make sure they know how to do it next time. Help somebody figure out, like, these are things I need to do anytime I change my phone number or my address. Again, you want to do something, what happens if you are gone on you want a miracle cruise for a month and you're gone and they move, you need to make sure that they know how to do it without you sitting there next to them doing that. But address changes are huge. Making sure people, again, reinforcing good habits, opening mail, teaching and practicing proper use of voicemail and email. A lot of things in immigration are going much more towards an electronic format. USCIS, which is the initial stage, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, right now they're still pretty heavily mail-based, but I am anticipating a time where it's going to be largely sign into our website and look up this, or file this online, or here's your email. One of the middle stages in the family-based process, they send it's from the State Department, it's called the National Visa Center. They send these emails that look like spam. The typing looks like weird typing that you would get if your Gmail was registering it as junk mail. Sometimes I've actually even seen it turn up in junk mail on occasion because of the format. Do people know? Do they have an email account? What do they do with that? Are they looking at it? Are they aware of different weird mailboxes in your email, that kind of thing? Can they do that when you're not there? So, and really again, that last piece of organization is huge. So emphasizing good habits, reinforcing them, encouraging people. Like if you see somebody doing something great, say, you're doing great. And that kind of thing. So we kind of addressed some of these here with common questions or myths. Question, I applied for asylum, can I work? Answer, maybe, maybe not. An asylum seeker is in between statuses. They don't have asylum yet, and there's not a guarantee they will get asylum. So it could change. That's something that, again, it's an expectation thing of like, this is not a guarantee necessarily. It's going to depend on a lot of different factors. My office does not file asylum applications, so I can't tell you what's the likelihood on that. But after somebody has filed for asylum and it has been pending for a certain amount of time, they are authorized to be able to ask for a work authorization document, EAD, or employment authorization document, little card. That then only ever lasts a year, and they can use that to work. So that is a situation where in a work environment, a work authorization card expiring does make a difference for someone who has not been granted asylum yet. But for a refugee, yes.
Well, you can finish your sentence.
Okay, I was gonna say, for a refugee or someone who has already been granted asylum, the second question of my card expired, the answer is yes, you can still keep working, even though your work authorization card expired. So this is where being granted status already versus trying to get a status can be a big difference. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering a couple things about the work authorization card from what you said before too, like why it expires in a year, but it doesn't really matter that it expired for the refugee. Does it serve as kind of a temporary ID card so they can get, like you said, they could use it kind of like an ID card to get a driver's license. So they're sort of expected to get other forms of ID within that year, and that's why it's only for a year.
I think you've actually said it very well, namely that for someone who's a refugee or who has been granted asylum, the work authorization document is really serving as a form of ID so that they can get other forms of ID, which then they can hopefully use at an employer. So one of the things that happens is people think, I have a work authorization document or an EAD card. I have to use that when I go to get a job. No, you don't. If you have other documents that appropriately fit the I-9 requirements, I won't get into those, but you can use those. And if an employer ever says, you have to show us X document, rather than something else that is appropriately on the list of identification documents, that employer is actually not following the law. And that employer potentially could get in trouble if they were really actively doing that. So, I mean, it can be confusing because it's like, oh, this is work authorization. One of the things is the card for work authorization does not itself actually confer status. It does not give you the refugee status or asylum status or any other kind of status if you've got that card. It allows you to work. It doesn't give you a status. You have something else somewhere else showing your status in a different way. There's something else that has allowed you to get that card. Yes?
Related to that, I had to go through the process with one family in terms of applying for, I think it was, well, it's for medical assistance, where it was use the online system. In any case, if we were indicating the status of the refugee, we had to show some document that said we were. In this case, we had those work permit things that weren't expired yet. So we could show what would happen if they're expired. They don't have anything that shows they're a refugee.
So, I mean, and one part that is part of what we encourage people to do when they first come is to apply for state ID or driver's license. That's always helpful because that will be much more recognized by a lot more agencies and things. So if they have that, then hopefully the need for certain other things will go away. Refugees and asylees will have an I-94. It's a printout. It looks like something you printed on your computer. They changed it. That technically is actually showing for the rest of their lives that they have refugee or asylee status. Because they changed it a couple years ago, people don't always recognize that. It does not have a photo on it, so sometimes certain organizations or like insurance or something like that need a photo ID. But technically, that is showing that that person for the rest of their lives, potentially, unless something really odd or strange happens, has that status.
And the I-94, technically, in and of itself, is all they need. But the EAD is providing a photo thing that makes it somewhat easier. But if they're coming as a refugee, that is all they need to show.
So when it comes to identifying yourself, you have to kind of go agency by agency and look at what their list is. So the Minnesota DMV has, I believe it's statutorily created, list of things which count as appropriate ID to prove who you are so you can get a Minnesota ID. So you have to follow their list and then look at that carefully and see if you can make some arguments if something's slightly off. For insurance, it could be a different list depending on what that insurance company has in their criteria.
Can I get the ID without the driver's license at the DMV?
Yeah, so I mean, I have clients who don't drive, and so they get a Minnesota ID, but they have same requirements for verifying who you are, even though you're not driving. I'm gonna touch on a couple of, just a little bit here. I think I already gotta mention this. Just because somebody says a crime or an issue is no big deal does not necessarily mean that. There's gonna be some more investigation, and general rule of thumb, don't do something without talking to someone first. Don't get your record expunged without keeping a copy of your own record. You can help people with that. I personally have never had to do that, so I don't know how to do it. I'd have to do some investigation. Maybe you can help somebody investigate something if something happens. Will your church be my financial sponsor? So for certain programs, filing to bring a family member, you have to have someone who's gonna say, I will take care of you. Or if something goes wrong and this person can't work or needs basic services, I will sponsor them financially. No agency or group can be a financial sponsor. It's an individual person. I get this call a lot from pastors or people who are working with someone. They say, oh, someone came to me and asked if our church can be a financial sponsor. The answer is no. You personally, if you feel it's appropriate and are comfortable with the situation, can choose to do that, but not your group. It can't be a collective thing. There are criteria based on your family size and your income and how many people are coming and all that kind of stuff, and there's some further things there. You are doing that in being a financial sponsor, creating a contract between you and the other person who is coming, and you and the US government. So some people are comfortable doing that, other people are not. I have some clients who have actually trouble finding financial sponsors because everybody they know is in a similar income bracket as them, and it's tough. And so they're like, I don't know anybody who's not, over this amount, that kind of thing. You can choose based on the situation, and after investigation, if you feel it's appropriate, that is something that you can do. But again, you have to be careful about it and decide, manage expectations, so.
Say an asylum seeker or refugee has a financial sponsor, are they responsible then to file income taxes for that sponsorship?
No, so a financial sponsor is when you're talking about bringing family members here. So someone who has asylum or refugee status never had a financial sponsor and does not need one. But if they're bringing family members through the I-130 program where the person, you're paying the fees and you're bringing them here, you are saying this person's not going on public benefits. They are not gonna be qualified to get cash assistance, food assistance. So that financial sponsor is standing in the gap and saying, if something goes wrong and this person is not working, or maybe they're elderly and never can work, they're never going to, I'm going to make sure they have the basic necessities they need. Like food, it's very vague, honestly, it just says 125% of the federal poverty level. It doesn't actually specify what that is. If it came to something, you'd probably end up, if there was a major issue, you'd probably end up in court, and the court would probably be looking at it going like, oh, you provided free housing, they live at your house. Well, that's part of your financial sponsorship. Like, you're making sure that person has housing. You're not paying them, but they have a place to live, so that counts as part of something. Hopefully, most of the time, people are actually pretty savvy and don't actually need that outside help. But that person is there saying, I'm ensuring that they are not going to go on public benefits because they're not qualified to in certain circumstances in the way they come. Again, that depends on the program and that kind of thing.
I'm assuming that would include like health insurance, so if that.
Health insurance, I always just say ask the insurance company. It's going to depend on what the insurance company has and what their criteria is. And the state programs are also, again, I think there are state programs where you can't if you're kind of in certain statuses. I've seen that where like maybe the whole family are like, 3 out of 5 are US citizens. They're on the Minnesota Care or something, and then like a couple other people aren't because they technically don't have the status needed. So last part here, just a reminder, just because someone says someone knows something, they may or may not. Ask some more questions. Look around, help someone research and find reputable agencies or attorneys if you're kind of wondering. Sometimes somebody's buddy is actually very savvy and knows what they're doing. Sometimes they don't. And that can be an area that gets very sticky very fast. So.
Can someone fill out applications for their family?
You can always file an application for yourself. You can always do that on your own. And you could, if you've got someone who's filed for citizenship and is pretty comfortable and knows their stuff, they can sit down and do it. They can file for themselves on their own. However, technically, you are practicing law if you are filling out the application for someone else, technically. Now, they recognize friends, family members will probably, help with certain stuff, and they're probably not gonna come after you or something like that. But if you've got somebody you don't know, have no connection to, and they're coming to you, hey, help me fill this out. Don't. That is practicing law. And that's where people accidentally get themselves into trouble because they don't realize answering yes or no on a particular question has some further details. So when in doubt, say, let's go talk to somebody who's accredited to do this, who's an attorney, who is at an agency that we know is reputable, or